1800s, Clarenceville saw substantial population growth as settlers, mainly from the United States, began to arrive. This land was originally part of New France and came under British control after the Treaty of Paris in 1783. By the early 1800s, the area was leased to individuals such as Colonel Henry Caldwell and later sold to Joseph Frederick Allard, who renamed it Allard's Manor. Omri Eady was born in 1821 in Lower Canada, his grandfather having emigrated from New Jersey and settled there in the early part of the century. They were among the oldest families in the region. The Eady residence was located on Beach Ridge, a picturesque country road leading from Clarenceville. The house stood about 3 miles from the town and 2 miles from the boundary line, typical of the numerous farm residences in the area, complete with a shaded lawn. It was visible from quite a distance, perched on a hill near the lake, overlooking the farmland. Mr. Eady was a prosperous, independent farmer who owned 2 large farms, primarily producing hay, which he sometimes held until spring to sell at higher prices. In 1850, Omri married Matilda Jane Eady, formerly known as Jane, and they had 3 children, Eady Emma Lucretia, Eady Pamelia, and Eady Herbert. Mr. Omri Eady was a respected figure in the community and one of the founding members of the Methodist Church in Clarenceville. Miss Eady was a kind and well-educated woman, held in high regard by all who knew her. On June 2, 1893, the farmhand Gilbert went to his home early in the evening and retired about 9 o'clock. He arose at daybreak and went to the Eady barn to feed and groom the horses. While engaged in this work, he observed smoke issuing from the kitchen and hurried to the spot. He ran across the garden, a space about 100 yards, and, rushing up to the west door, facing the road, broke it in with his foot. An outburst of smoke drove him away. He was well acquainted with the plan of the house and knew that the old couple, Mr. and Miss Eady, was in the habit of sleeping in a bedroom on the ground floor in the northeast corner, and that the daughter generally occupied the room above them. He therefore ran around the house to arouse the sleepers. Looking through a window near the bed of Mr. and Mrs. Eady, he observed that it had never been occupied. Breaking a pane, he thrust his hand in and pulled off the counterpane to satisfy himself that no one was there. He then ran back to the door which he had first broken in, and, as the outburst of smoke had cleared away, he observed a woman lying on her back on the floor at the left of the threshold and about 4 feet from it. Thinking that she had been suffocated, he picked her up and carried her to the lawn. He then recognized her as Miss Eady, although her eyes were blackened and her face covered with blood. Immediately and for the first time, he suspected a murder. Rushing back to found Mrs. Eady lying quite close to where her daughter Emma had been, and in a similar position with the head to the door. He carried her out and returned for the old gentleman. At the right of the door and about 6 feet from it, seated in an armchair, was Mr. Eady. Picking him up, Gilbert was just emerging from the burning house when one of the neighbors arrived. This was James Hawley, who lives about as far to the north of the scene of the tragedy as Gilbert does to the south. He had heard no report of firearms or any other noise during the night, and the appearance of smoke curling over the top of the trees. He assisted Gilbert to lay the old man quietly on the grass, and then both turned their attention to the fire. It had gained too much headway, however, and in the absence of any extinguishing apparatus, the house was soon burned to the ground. All traces of the brutal deed within were thus completely obliterated. If the bodies had not been rescued, a murder would never have been suspected. Other neighbors arrived soon. Among them was Major Hawley, a justice of the peace, who ordered the bodies to be left as they were until the arrival of the coroner, and then went in search of that officer. In the meantime, Uric Chilton, the mayor of the corporation, appeared on the scene, and as it was raining, he ordered the bodies to be removed to the residence of the late Peter Eady, a brother of the murdered man. They soon called Dr. Mitchell to examine the bodies. He said that when he examined the body of Miss Emma Eady, he found her breast cruelly bruised as though the assassin had knelt upon her to deal the fatal stroke. In the case of her mother, she had been seized by the hair as she was emerging from the sitting room. In explanation from some of the neighbors, that Friday night was very thunder and lightning mixed, so it hardly to hear gunshots. The friends of the Eady family scout the theory that Mr. Eady killed his wife and daughter while temporarily insane and then committed suicide. The home life of the family is said to have been very pleasant. A Frenchman named Ford, who moved to Swanton, was once evicted from the Edie farm and had threatened revenge, but he accounts for his whereabouts at the time the murder must have been committed. Outsiders at that time suspected Gilbert, but those acquainted with him and the Edie family believe his story. It was known that Mr. Edie was accustomed to keep considerable money in the house, and it is generally believed in the vicinity of Clarenceville that the family were killed and the house plundered. But the facts that the house was only partially on fire at 4 o'clock in the morning and that the three victims were dressed deepens the mystery of the case. The news of the tragedy spread with great rapidity. Clarenceville is in telephonic and telegraphic communication with Montreal and other business centers. Relatives and friends quickly sent the news to their married daughter, Mrs. Lucretia, living in Plattsburgh in New York, and a son, Herbert, manufacturer's agent, whose place of business is 100 McGill Street, Montreal. The latter was eating his breakfast at his residence on Metcalf Street when he was called to the telephone to receive the following message. "Your father was murdered last night. Come out as soon as you can." Herbert's feelings may be imagined better than can be described, but worse to come. He immediately went downtown only to find that the train had left for L'École, the nearest station to his old home, and that the next train would not depart until late in the afternoon. On going to his office, he was told the whole horrible truth. The blow was a terrible one, but he bore it wonderfully. The only detectives available were Sub-Chief Lancy of the city force and Detective Douglas of Carpenter's agency. With these, Edie left the city in the evening. The scene along the road was pitiful. Neighbor after neighbor returning Tron, the smoldering ruins stopped to shake his hand in sympathy and pass on in silence. The beginning of a fearful struggle with a resolute mind began when he stopped at the residence of his aunt, Mrs. Robert Kemp, the only surviving sister of his murdered mother. She was completely prostrated with grief, and it was with the utmost difficulty that his feelings could be restrained. About 9 o'clock, he was taken to the old Edie homestead to see the remains of his parents and his sister. They presented a ghastly sight sufficient to break the fortitude of the strongest. The three bodies lay in the parlor, stretched side by side upon a large table, almost as they were found. It is a singular circumstance that when Gilbert rescued them from the flames, they were all completely dressed, except that the father had both shoes off and the daughter one shoe off. The father had a bullet hole over the right brow. The mother had been shot just below the bridge of the nose, exactly between the eyes, and had a ghastly cut on the throat extending from ear to ear. Both of these appeared to have died without a struggle. The old man's face was peaceful. There was almost a smile upon that of the aged mother. It was very different with the daughter. She was a woman of medium height and of very powerful physique, and her appearance indicated that she had made a terrible struggle for life. Both eyes were blackened and badly bruised. The bridge of the nose was smashed and pounded, apparently by repeated blows from some heavy instrument, and over the left eyebrow, the skull was deeply indented as if by some metallic substance. Her throat was also cut from ear to ear, as her mother's had been. The palms of her hands were bruised and chafed. The back of the left hand was swollen and discolored as if it had received one of the blows intended for the head. On one finger was a rubber band that had been used to secure a purse. The daughter's purse, however, was missing. The old gentleman's right-hand trooper's pocket was turned inside out, but his purse was on his left. There also remained a silver watch he usually carried about the farm. The faces of the three were smeared with blood, and heads were more or less disfigured by the scalpels of the surgeons who probed for the bullets. To see his beloved parents and sister so cruelly hacked and butchered was truly sickening, and it is no wonder the son broke down completely. As the investigation into the violent murder of 20-year-old Emma, suspicions have emerged regarding an angry boyfriend or a spurned admirer. This speculation arises from the fact that she was engaged to a well-known journalist in Montreal, with their wedding just weeks away. Emma's parents were killed quickly, while her own murder was more brutal and prolonged, suggesting a personal motive. It appears that the parents may have been seated around a table when they were attacked, either willingly or under duress, with the killer executing the shootings in rapid succession. When Emma attempted to flee, the assailant tackled her, leaving abrasions on her palms, and then beat her. Many observers believe that she bore the brunt of the attacker's fury. Although she was not shot, she was struck with a blunt object. Despite these theories, there remains insufficient evidence to identify the true killer. Eleanor Mills walked to a neighbor's house to return a call from her church minister. Now in her 30s, she had married James Mills in 1905 at the age of 15 and had two children, Charlotte and Danny. Active in her church, she had been part of the choir since she was 14. 9 months earlier, in December 1921, Eleanor underwent kidney surgery. Since her husband couldn't afford the procedure, Reverend Edward Hall, the church minister, agreed to cover the costs in installments. Eleanor needed to discuss the bill with him. After finishing her call, she got ready, donning her hat, scarf, and shawl, and left their four-room apartment at 7:30 p.m. on September 14, 1922, without informing James or her teenage children of her whereabouts. She took the trolley to the end of the line and headed toward Deusy Lane, New Jersey. Meanwhile, about 5 blocks away, Reverend Hall had just finished dinner with his wife, Frances, and her brother, Willie Stevens. Hall and Frances had married on July 20th, 1911, when he was 30 and she was 37. They lived in a two-story red brick house near the Protestant Episcopal Church of St. John the Evangelist, where he served as minister. At around 7:30 p.m., as Eleanor left her home, Hall also departed after telling his wife and brother-in-law that he was going to meet Mrs. Mills about her medical bill. By 10:30 p.m., Eleanor had not returned. Concerned, James went to the church to search for her, but she was not there. Knowing she sometimes stayed away for a few days, he returned home and went to bed. The next morning at 5:45 a.m., he noticed her absence, but didn't report her missing at that time. At 2:30 a.m., Frances Hall knocked on her brother's bedroom door, worried because Edward hadn't come home. She asked Willie to accompany her to the church to check for him. They quickly dressed and found the church dark. They then went to the Mills apartment, waiting a few minutes without seeing any lights. They returned home and continued their search the following morning. That afternoon, Frances reported her husband missing to the police. On September 16, 1922, 2 days after Hall and Mills were last seen, 23-year-old Raymond Schneider and 15-year-old Pearl Balmer were walking at 10 a.m. near New Brunswick, New Jersey, when they discovered two bodies beneath a crabapple tree on Deusy Lane. The woman's head rested on the man's right arm, and her left hand lay on his knee, while a Panama hat obscured the man's face. It appeared they had been killed and then arranged in that position. Shocked by their find, Schneider and Balmer hurried to inform the nearest neighbor, Grace Edwards, who called the police. When Patrolman Edward Garrigan and Officer James Curran arrived, they examined the scene and the fully clothed bodies. Both had been shot, and the woman's throat had been cut. A business card, belonging to Reverend Edward W. Hall, was propped against the man's left heel. A dark leather wallet found on the ground contained Hall's driver's license. The woman was identified as Eleanor R. Mills, 34, the wife of the church's sexton. Torn pieces of paper were scattered around the bodies. According to author William Kunstler, it became clear that Hall was romantically involved with Mills, a soprano in the church choir. In one letter, Mills expressed her feelings, saying, "I know there are girls with more shapely bodies, but I do not care what they have. I have the greatest of all blessings, the deep, true, and eternal love of a noble man. My heart is his, my life is his, all that I have is his. I am his forever." While no weapons were found at the scene, several cartridge shells from an automatic pistol were present. An undertaker transported the bodies in a hearse that afternoon. As Hall's coat was removed, a bullet fell to the floor. He had been shot once in the head, while Mills had been hit 3 times, and her throat had been slashed from ear to ear. An autopsy revealed that the couple had been killed around 10 p.m. on September 14th, about 36 hours before their bodies were discovered. The angle of the wounds suggested that Hall's killer stood over him when he was shot. Meanwhile, Hall's brother-in-law, Willie Stevens, was sitting in the parlor of their shared mansion, reading the New York Times. His aunt, Mrs. Charles Carpenter, arrived to inform him that Edward had been shot. Willie dropped the newspaper, lowering his head in shock. 2 days later, on September 18th, more than 200 mourners filled St. John's, a small stone church, for Hall's funeral. Afterwards, he was buried in Greenwood Cemetery in Brooklyn. Only a handful of people turned up for Mills' funeral the next morning in a small chapel at the Hubbard Funeral Home. Then the investigation into the double murder began in earnest. Police initially suspected that Mr. Mills, Mrs. Hall, and her 2 brothers Willie and Henry Stevens, were behind the killings. Frances Hall and her brothers were questioned repeatedly. Although many of the church's parishioners knew about the affair between the minister and the choir singer, James Mills and Frances Hall each initially claimed to police that they had no idea it was happening. 3 weeks before Mills had her surgery, Hall sent her a single red rose with a love note. Frances Hall's brother Willie was known to have a fiery temperament. He also owned a .32 caliber revolver, although he claimed that it had not been fired in more than 10 years. When police examined the weapon, they determined that it was not capable of firing and then returned it to Stevens. Older brother Henry Stevens was a firearms expert who was once an exhibition marksman. He lived 50 miles from the scene of the murder. Eleanor Mills and her family often went over to neighbor Millie Opie's home to use her telephone. Opie, a dressmaker, told police that Eleanor met Edward Hall almost every day at her apartment while her husband was at work. The Reverend often parked his car across from the house. This latest titillating piece of information put the story of the double murder back on the front pages of newspapers. Police were making little headway in the case, however. On September 27th, Somerset County Prosecutor Azariah Beekman announced at a news conference that he had applied to Supreme Court Justice Charles W. Parker to have the body of Eleanor Mills exhumed. He hoped to unearth more clues about how she died and who her killer could be. Her body was disinterred 2 days later and brought back to Hubbard's funeral home, where she had first been taken after her body was discovered. Dr. Runkle Hegeman and Dr. Arthur L. Smith performed the autopsy on the mother of 2 teenagers. The 2 men confirmed that she had been shot 3 times in the head. Her head was nearly decapitated after her throat was cut from ear to ear, and her windpipe and esophagus were severed. 2.32 caliber bullets were removed and turned over to Detective George D. Totten from the Somerset County Prosecutor's Office. Hall's body was exhumed a week later, on October 5th. An autopsy revealed nothing new. Hall had been shot in the head through the right temple. In the meantime, a reward of $1,000 was offered for information leading to an arrest and conviction in the case. The money was put forward by Middlesex County's Board of Freeholders, with the stipulation that the reward would only be given out if the murder had been committed in Middlesex County. The reward was never claimed, but curious bystanders and souvenir hunters were flocking to the scene of the crime. Crowds gathered on a Sunday in early October at the Phillips farm, near where the murders occurred, to watch members of the New Brunswick police and county detectives rake fall leaves in a desperate attempt to find the murder weapons. Even reporters got in on the act. They grabbed shovels, rakes, and axes and searched the 2 wells on the property. No murder weapons were found, but some spectators did more than just watch. Souvenir hunters ripped out the old porch of the house on the property, and one person pulled out a window pane and opened the front door. More souvenir hunters entered and destroyed furniture in their quest for souvenirs. Their presence was beginning to hinder the investigation. On October 2nd, police learned that after the murders, Mrs. Hall had sent some clothing to Philadelphia to be dyed. A clerk at Borno's cleaning and dyeing plant said that they had received some garments from Mrs. Hall on September 20th, 6 days after the double murder. The company dyed the items black and returned them to Mrs. Hall 4 days later. A week later, investigators interrogated Raymond Schneider, Pearl Baumer, Clifford Hayes, and Leon Kaufman. Baumer said that Schneider had brought her home at 9:30 p.m. on September 14th, and then her inebriated father ordered her to accompany him as he walked off his intoxication. Detectives grilled Schneider and Hayes for 12 hours, and then turned their attention to 16-year-old Kaufman. On September 14th, he had met Schneider and Hayes at 10:30 p.m. in front of the Rivoli Theater. They started following Baumer and a drunken companion with whom she was walking. Hayes took a pistol out from a holster under his married lovers and said that he was going to fight the man who was accompanying Baumer. The youths followed the couple to the entrance of Buccleuch Park. Then they lost sight of Baumer and her companion. They entered the park looking for them, but when they didn't find their quarry, they left to walk around the neighborhood. They returned to the park at 11 p.m., and Kaufman left his friends behind. The prosecutor's office theorized that Hayes had been in love with Pearl Baumer. It was theorized that Hayes stumbled upon Hall and Mills, then shot them in a mistaken belief they were Baumer and another man. The day that the body of Eleanor Mills was exhumed, Francis Hall hired Timothy N. Pfeiffer, a former assistant district attorney of New York County, to investigate her husband's death. Pfeiffer had not uncovered any new information by the time police announced on October 9, 1922, that they had arrested Clifford Hayes in connection with the double slaying and were charging him with murder. Hayes was brought to the Somerset County Jail. Police failed to explain why Hayes would have slashed Mills's throat, posed the bodies, and scattered the love letters around them. The public was not convinced that the police had the right man behind bars. Detective Frank F. Kirby had induced Schneider to make the accusations against his friend Hayes. As Kirby tried to walk the 4 blocks from the train station to the courthouse in New Brunswick, people followed him hurling insults and throwing stones. A fund was set up to pay for Hayes's legal defense. 3 days after Schneider made his accusations, he recanted his statement that Hayes had killed Hall and Mills. Following a hearing the next afternoon at 1:30 p.m., the charges against Hayes were dropped and he was released. Investigators turned their attention back to Frances Hall, her brothers, James Mills, and his 16-year-old daughter Charlotte. The young girl had recently sold a packet of her mother's love letters to the New York American for $500. During the investigation, grand juries were convened in New Brunswick and Middlesex counties, but no indictments were filed. The police appeared to be stumped. Then a new witness stepped forward on October 24th. Jane Gibson was a 50-year-old widow who lived with her son on a 60-acre hog farm. She told police that her dogs began to bark at about 9 p.m. on September 14th. This drew her attention to a person in her cornfield. She thought he was stealing her corn, so she mounted a mule and rode off after the prowler. She followed him into Deussy's lane. That, she said, is when she saw 4 people at the scene of the Hall and Mills murder. In the moonless darkness, it appeared that 2 men and 2 women were standing near a crabapple tree, silhouetted against the sky. Suddenly, there was the sound of a gunshot, and one person fell to the ground. A woman cried, "Don't! Don't!" There were more gunshots, and another person collapsed. As Gibson fled, she said she heard a woman shout, "Henry!" Gibson said that she had tried to share her story with police after Hayes was arrested, but they were not interested. Her story did not match the police's evidence and autopsy report that Edward Hall had been shot while he was lying on the ground. Gibson, whom newspapers dubbed the Pig Woman because of her hog farm, added more details to her story. She said that she saw a touring car parked near the scene of the crime. The headlights of a second vehicle allowed her to get a good look at the 4 people she saw there. One of them was a woman wearing a long coat. Another person was a man with bushy hair and a dark mustache. Willie Stevens was about 5 feet 10 inches tall, 54 years old, and had thick bushy hair. Gibson also suddenly remembered that one woman had asked, "How do you explain these notes?" She added that Eleanor Mills had tried to run and hide, but the killers caught up to her and dragged her back to the spot where the minister lay. She was shot 3 times. During a third interview, Gibson claimed that she had returned to the scene at 1 a.m. to try to find the moccasins she had lost when she fled home earlier that evening. When she approached the crabapple tree, she said she saw Mrs. Hall, whom she described as a woman with white hair, kneeling beside her husband's corpse and weeping loudly. A neighbor of Mrs. A.C. Fraley lived across Deussy's lane. She said that she was awake the night that Hall and Mills were both shot, yet she didn't remember hearing any shouting or the gunfire that Gibson described. When the neighbor spoke to Gibson the next morning, the Pig Woman made no mention of the shootings. Mrs. Fraley's boarders didn't mention it either. Gibson was also discredited after it was discovered that she had lied about her marital status. She claimed to be the widow of a minister, but her husband, toolmaker William Easton, was still very much alive and well. In November 1922, Gibson claimed that the shooter was Henry Carpenter, Francis Hall's cousin, but Carpenter's alibi was solid. He told police that he had dinner with his wife and some friends until 10:30 p.m. the night of the shooting. On November 20th, 1922, a third grand jury was convened. They heard from 67 witnesses and adjourned 5 days later without making any indictments. And that is where the case rested until July 1926. Louise Geist, Edward and Francis Hall's former maid, had married piano tuner Arthur S. Reel in 1925. 10 months later, on July 3, 1926, Reel filed a petition in the Court of Chancery in Trenton for an annulment. He said that Louise told him she had been working for the Halls at the time of the murder. According to Reel, Geist had told Francis Hall that Edward Hall planned to elope with Eleanor Mills. Then the Hall's chauffeur drove Geist, Mrs. Hall, and Willie Stevens to the scene of the murders. Geist was then paid $5,000 to keep quiet about what she knew. Both Geist and the chauffeur denied the story, but newspapers picked it up. They weren't the only ones. New Jersey Governor A. Harry Moore appointed Special Prosecutor Alexander Simpson to reopen and review the case. Simpson was a state senator from Hudson County. On July 28, 1926, Francis Hall, Willie Stevens, Henry Stevens, and cousin Henry de la Bruyere Carpenter were arrested and charged with murder. Carpenter successfully petitioned to be tried separately. Much of the evidence that had been collected in the case in 1922 was missing, but a grand jury decided nonetheless to indict the four. The accused all pleaded not guilty. A new autopsy performed on Eleanor Mills revealed that her killer had cut out her tongue and larynx. During a preliminary hearing in Somerville, Jane Gibson testified that at about 9 p.m. on the night of September 14, 1922, she heard a wagon traveling on the road near her farm. She thought that it might be thieves who had been stealing her corn, so she saddled her mule and set off in pursuit. Once she reached Deusy Lane, in the glare of a car's headlights, she saw two figures that she identified as Francis Hall and Willie Stevens. As she got closer to the scene, she saw that there were four people. One held a flashlight, which allowed her to see another person's face. At first, she identified the person as Henry Carpenter, then as being Henry Stevens. Gibson testified that she suddenly heard a shot and then three more. That's when she fled on her mule as she heard a woman say, "Oh, Henry!" She said she returned to the scene about 3 hours later to try to find her missing moccasin. That, she said, is when she saw Francis Hall weeping by her husband's side. Jane Gibson became the state's main witness against Hall, her two brothers, and her cousin when the trial opened on November 3, 1926, before judges Charles Parker and Frank Cleary. However, testimony revealed that Gibson wasn't able to pick out the suspects when she first saw them. Neighbor George Soipel also said that Gibson had tried to bribe him with cash to support her testimony. Gibson arrived in court on a stretcher pleading ill health, but her testimony was interrupted when her own mother rose from the gallery and shouted that her daughter was a liar. The prosecutor's evidence also included a fingerprint from William Stevens that was apparently found on the business card that had been left by Reverend Hall's heel. He also told the court that Mrs. Hall had dyed a coat black after the murders. During the trial, Charlotte Mills identified her mother's love letters. Witness Ralph Gosline testified that he had seen Henry Stevens near the scene of the murder on September 14, 1922. Former State Trooper Henry Dickman claimed that Henry Carpenter paid him $2,500 to drop the case. Under cross-examination, it turned out that Dickman had been recently incarcerated at Alcatraz as a military deserter. That tainted his credibility as a witness. Defense witnesses supported the alibi that Henry Stevens offered. Francis Hall and William Stevens took the stand in their own defense and denied any involvement in the murder. Jurors listened to 157 witnesses. Then they deliberated for 5 hours on December 3, 1926, before acquitting all three defendants. Henry Carpenter was never tried. Deusy Lane was subsequently renamed Franklin Boulevard. The crabapple tree under which the bodies had been found is no longer there. In fact, souvenir hunters cut it to pieces, roots and all, the first weekend after the unsolved double murder.